The town of Fairhaven was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night. A quiet, peaceful community where the biggest crimes were stolen bicycles and the occasional drunken fight outside a bar. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, where children played in the streets, and where the idea of monsters belonged only in stories. Until the first body was found. It was a cold October morning when the Henderson family woke to a silence that felt unnatural. Their son, Adam, hadn't come down for breakfast. At first, his mother assumed he had overslept. She climbed the stairs, knocked on his bedroom door, then opened it without a second thought. She didn't scream at first, because what she saw didn't make sense. Adam lay in bed, his body stiff, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. His eyes wide open stared at the ceiling, not just with fear, but with something deeper, something primal, something that suggested he had seen something before he died. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds, no bruises, just long, deep scratches along his arms, as though he had been clawed by something that didn't exist. The autopsy only deepened the mystery. The coroner found no signs of trauma, no toxic substances. It was as if he had died of pure terror. His heart had simply stopped. Then they found the mark. Carved just beneath his collarbone, deep enough to scar, but not enough to bleed, was a symbol. A perfect circle, intersected by two curved lines, resembling the face of a clock missing its hands. By the time the second body appeared, the town was already on edge. This time, it was a young woman. Julia Carson, 25 years old, found in her apartment, her expression identical to Adam's. Frozen in horror, her body twisted in unnatural angles, the same scratches, the same lack of any reasonable cause of death, and the same mark carved into her skin. Fairhaven was no longer a place where people left their doors unlocked. The police had no suspects, no connections between the victims, no forced entries, no signs of foul play. But the whispers had already started. It wasn't just a killer, it was something else. The town's nightmares had come to life. Then came James Miller, a local history professor, found slumped over his desk. But James was different, because he had fought back. Unlike the others, he wasn't found in his bed or frozen in fear. His office was a wreck, bookshelves toppled, papers scattered, his desk lamp shattered. His arms were covered in deep gashes, as if he had been fighting off something invisible. And next to his body, scrawled onto a sheet of paper in his own trembling handwriting, were the last words he ever wrote. I saw it, and it saw me. The police couldn't make sense of it. There were no footprints, no fingerprints. The security cameras outside his office flickered out at exactly 2:13 a.m., the same time his watch had stopped. By the time the fourth body was found, panic had set in. People weren't just afraid of a murderer. They were afraid to sleep. The town's psychiatrist, Dr. Evelyn Harper, was the first to notice the pattern. All 4 victims had reported having nightmares in the days leading up to their deaths. Not just nightmares, the same nightmare. They described a figure watching them from the shadows, its body shifting like smoke, its face obscured by an endless ticking clock. They all spoke of the same moment, the moment when the figure stepped closer. When they realized the clock wasn't missing its hands, it had never needed them. Because time didn't matter when you were trapped inside a nightmare. Dr. Harper tried to warn the police. No one listened. And then one night, she closed her eyes, and she dreamed of the clock. Detective Harris had seen death before. He had worked homicide for nearly 2 decades, investigating the darkest corners of human nature. But this was different. The town of Fairhaven wasn't just dealing with a serial killer. They were dealing with something else entirely. He stood over the most recent victim, Dr. Evelyn Harper, the town's psychiatrist. Unlike the others, she had tried to resist. Her fingernails were cracked and broken, the carpet beneath her torn where she had tried to claw herself awake. The deep scratches on her arms weren't just from struggle, they were identical to the ones on the others, like something had marked her. And then there was the symbol, carved into the skin above her heart, just like the others. A perfect clock missing its hands. Harris clenched his jaw. It was precise, almost surgical. No signs of hesitation, no variation. Whoever was doing this wasn't just killing. They were making a statement. He needed answers. The autopsy confirmed what he already feared. There was no logical cause of death, no cardiac arrest, no suffocation, no neurological trauma. Dr. Harper had simply stopped being alive. Harris didn't believe in the supernatural. But the facts weren't making sense. The victims weren't just being murdered. They were dying in their sleep. Something was killing them from the inside. His only lead was the symbol. The same clock-like marking carved into every victim. It wasn't something random. It meant something. He locked himself in his office and started digging. Old case files, folklore, criminal psychology reports. He even reached out to a symbolist expert at a nearby university. But it wasn't until he came across an obscure case from 1987 that the pieces started to connect. A psychiatric patient, James Rothel, had been committed to a facility after claiming he could control people's dreams. His therapists dismissed him as delusional, until his fellow patients started dying in their sleep. One by one, their bodies were found frozen in silent, mind-numbing terror, and each of them had the same symbol carved into their flesh. The official records claimed Rothel died in the asylum. His body was found hanging in his cell, his own symbol burned into his chest as if it had been seared into his skin from the inside. But Harris dug deeper. The burial records were missing. There was no official record of his death certificate. No known location for his remains. It was as if he had simply vanished. Or worse, as if he had never died at all. Harris felt the hairs on his arms rise. What if James Rothel had found a way to escape? What if he had perfected his twisted abilities and was now walking among them? The nightmares, the unexplained deaths, the return of the symbol. It wasn't a coincidence. Harris pulled up the first victim's file, Adam Henderson. A college student, bright, ambitious. He checked his personal records, his coursework, his research. Then he found it. Adam had been writing a thesis on James Rothel, and in his final unfinished notes, scrawled in a frantic, nearly illegible script, he had written, "I found his grave. The stone was blank, but I know he's still here." Harris's blood ran cold. The victims weren't random. They were being chosen, not by accident, not by impulse, by someone who had been watching them in their sleep. And now, Harris was watching the clock on his desk. It had stopped ticking. Sarah had spent the last 6 months trying to forget. She had left Fairhaven. She had cut ties. She had changed her phone number, moved states, stopped sleeping altogether. But none of it had mattered, because when she closed her eyes, she was still there, in the dark, with him. She had never spoken about what had happened, not to the police, not to a therapist, not even to herself, because saying it out loud meant admitting that it was real. And if it was real, then there was no escaping it. But when Detective Harris called, something in his voice told her she didn't have a choice. "You're the only one who survived," he had said. "If you know anything, anything that can help us, please." She almost hung up. But she didn't, because she knew it wasn't over. So she agreed to meet him at a small run-down diner outside of town, far away from the places where it all began. The lights buzzed overhead. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Harris had seen fear before, but never like this. Sarah's hands trembled as she stirred her drink, eyes darting to every shadow, as if something might crawl out of them. as if something already had. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "Tell me about the night you saw him," Harris said. She let out a slow, shaky breath. Then she began. It had started as a dream. She was in her childhood home, standing in the dimly lit hallway just outside her bedroom. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. And then she heard the ticking. Soft at first, faint, like a clock hidden behind the walls. Then louder, closer. She turned, and the hallway stretched before her, endless and dark. She took a step forward. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet. And then she saw the shadow. It was long and twisted, stretching from the far end of the hallway. But there was no one there, just the ticking. Tick, tick, tick. She ran. The hallway didn't end. No matter how fast she moved, the walls just stretched on forever. The doors lining the corridor were wrong, shifting, twisting into impossible shapes. Then she heard the breathing. Slow, deep, right behind her. She turned, and he was there. A figure draped in darkness, his face obscured except for the clock carved into his forehead. No hands, no numbers, just the symbol. And then he spoke, not in words, not in sound, but in her mind. "You are awake, but you do not belong here." Then he raised his hand, and the nightmare became real. The walls collapsed, the air turned thick, suffocating, wrapping around her like living shadows. Something was in the dark with her, something she couldn't see, but could feel. Claws scraping against her skin, a whisper that wasn't a whisper. And then pain, real pain, not in the dream, in her body. She woke up screaming. Blood was on her arms, the same deep scratches the others had. Her heart was racing, pounding so hard she thought it would burst. But when she sat up, gasping for breath, her room was still, silent, except for the ticking. She turned. The clock on her nightstand had stopped. 3 a.m., the exact time the others had died, and carved into the wood, just beneath the clock's face. The symbol, the same one on every victim's skin. She stopped speaking, her breath ragged. Harris didn't move, didn't blink. Because she wasn't just telling him a story. She was proving something. This killer, whoever, whatever he was, wasn't just taking lives. He was choosing them. And now, Harris realized, he had chosen him too. Because sitting on the diner table, right next to his untouched coffee, was his watch. And sometime during her story, it had stopped ticking. Harris had spent most of his life chasing killers. He had tracked them through alleyways, kicked down doors, followed blood trails through places most people wouldn't dare to enter. He had seen what men were capable of, their cruelty, their madness. But this was different. This wasn't a man. This was something else. The town of Fairhaven was already under siege by fear. People weren't just afraid of dying. They were afraid of sleeping. Reports were coming in from every corner of town, nightmares too vivid, too real. People waking up with scratches on their skin, waking up gasping for breath, convinced that someone, something, had been in their rooms. And then came the final piece of the puzzle, the warehouse. Abandoned for over 40 years, it sat on the edge of town, forgotten, decayed, rotting into the ground. But inside, Harris found the proof he had been looking for. The walls were covered in symbols, drawn in something too dark, too thick to be ink. The same markings found on the victims, but more of them, hundreds of them, layered over one another like a language not meant to be understood. And the centerpiece, a massive clock, not made of gears, not mechanical, but etched into the concrete itself. A spiraling, circular mass of numbers and intersecting lines, shifting in the dim light. It had no hands, no indication of time, just an endless presence, a reminder. Tick, tick, tick. Except there was no sound, Harris's breath came slow, controlled, but his pulse hammered against his ribs. The air inside the warehouse was thick, heavy with something that didn't belong in this world. And then, from the far end of the room, something moved. At first it was just a shadow, a distortion against the concrete. But then the darkness shifted, bent, and stepped forward. A man, if you could call it that. Tall, thin, a face obscured in shifting darkness, but there, carved into his skin, glowing faintly in the dim light. The clock symbol. Harris reached for his gun. The thing laughed, a sound that didn't echo, that didn't belong in the space it occupied. It was hollow, distant, like something being played on an old record, distorted, stretched, unnatural. "You think that will help you?" the figure said. The air around Harris warped. The warehouse began to shift, the walls stretching, the symbols twisting. He felt pulled, like gravity had turned against him. His mind screamed at him to move, but his feet were no longer on solid ground. The world was gone. The clock had swallowed him whole. He was standing in his childhood bedroom. The smell of his mother's perfume lingered in the air. The nightlight by the bed glowed a soft amber, casting flickering shadows against the walls. He knew this place. He hadn't been here in over 30 years. Then the sound started. Tick, tick, tick. Slow, measured. Not coming from the nightstand. From behind him. Harris turned, and the walls stretched out into an endless hallway. The shadows moved unnaturally, bending as if they had a life of their own, and standing at the far end, the thing wearing a man's skin. The nightmare had followed him. It stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Harris tried to move, tried to force himself awake, but his body wasn't his anymore. He was frozen, just like the victims had been. The thing raised its hand, and the walls collapsed inward. Hands. Not human hands, but something else, something twisted and wrong. Erupted from the darkness, clawing at him, pulling him down. He could feel them on his skin, dragging him into a place where time didn't exist. "You have seen too much," the thing whispered, "and now you belong to me." Harris screamed. There was no air, no light, only the clock. Harris felt himself being dragged down, pulled through a space that wasn't meant for the living. Shadows curled around him, whispering in voices he almost recognized. His own voice, his mother's voice, his father's voice, twisted, distorted, mocking. His feet hit solid ground. But when he looked around, there was nothing, just endless black. Then, far above him, a sound. A slow, deliberate tick. He looked up. A massive clock hung in the darkness, suspended over an abyss that had no bottom. Its face was made of shifting stone and flesh, its gears moving without a source, without logic. And in the center, standing beneath its gaze, was him, the thing wearing his body. It wasn't James Rothel. It wasn't the killer Harris had been hunting. It was something older, something that had been waiting. It tilted its head, watching him. "You understand now, don't you?" Harris tried to speak. He couldn't. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his lungs didn't pull in air, because there was no air here. "You thought I was a man," the thing continued. "A killer, a nightmare made of flesh." It took a step forward. "But I am not made of flesh." It raised its hand, and the space around them shifted. The blackness peeled away, revealing faces. Hundreds of them, frozen in time. The victims. Their bodies weren't dead. They weren't bodies at all. They were fragments, echoes, trapped within the shifting walls of this place. "You called them victims," the thing whispered. "But they were never victims. They were the price." Harris felt his knees buckle. This was why the bodies had no cause of death, why the victims had been found frozen, staring into the abyss. Because they hadn't died. They had been taken, not to the afterlife, not to some supernatural prison. To this place, a space outside of time, a ticking clock that never stopped counting down. And now, he was part of it. The thing took another step forward, and the walls pulsed like a living organism. Harris could feel the others, the ones who had come before him. Trapped inside the dream, trapped inside him. "I don't kill," the thing whispered. "I collect." Harris forced himself to move, to fight against whatever this was. His hands shook, his thoughts blurred. The air around him pressed inward, thick with the weight of things he wasn't meant to understand. He reached for his gun. The thing laughed. The sound wrapped around him, sinking into his skin, into his thoughts. "You still don't get it," it whispered. "There is no waking up." The walls collapsed inward. The clock above them began to move. For the first time, Harris saw it. The clock had hands. But they had been waiting for him, waiting for a new time to be set. The hands began to turn, and in that moment, Harris finally understood. He wasn't going to die. He was going to become part of the nightmare. The next morning, the people of Fairhaven woke to an eerie silence. The nightmares had stopped. The whispers, the scratches, the strange deaths, all of it was gone. Detective Harris had vanished without a trace. His office was undisturbed, his case files neatly stacked on his desk. The only sign that he had ever been there was his watch, sitting in the center of the table. It had stopped at 3:06 a.m. and carved into the wood beneath it. The clock symbol. Final scene. 1 year later, the town had moved on. The disappearances had faded into local legend, a story whispered in bars and told to newcomers as a warning. But one night, a new clock appeared, carved into the alley behind a local cafe. The first victim was found the next morning. A young woman, frozen in place, her eyes staring at something no one else could see. And next to her body, burned into the pavement, was a message. Time does not stop. It only resets. The clock had begun to tick again. And this time, it had a new owner,